morning, everybody. We will be starting in about 5 minutes, and just please note that you will be muted upon entry, but you will have access to the chat box and Q&A and the participant list. We'll see you soon.
I hope you're enjoying the conference this year, and the new format with the breakout rooms is proving to provide a great conference experience. I think that especially under the current lockdown, it's important that we can still carry on significant pieces of our work, and professional development certainly falls under that category. The central core value of Better Impact, it's to be here to help. And we do that in a variety of ways. It can be helping conferences such as this one and PAVRO in their initiatives. It can be helping you learn whether or not Better Impact and volunteer impact software is a great fit for your organization. And of course, it can be in helping our members, supporting them and training them as they use our software. We've also done what we can to help through the various stages of the pandemic. And it's been very fulfilling to work with a number of hospitals and organizations lately to help them ramp up their efforts as quickly as possible to be able to administer COVID vaccines through the engagement of volunteers. You know, modern and dedicated volunteer management software can have a real significant impact on your organization and your volunteer engagement there. And if you're still using spreadsheets or any form of database that hasn't evolved along with professional volunteer management, or you find yourself waiting for support from your current volunteer management provider, I really encourage you to take a look at the real variety of software packages available these days and find the one that best fits your needs so that you can begin to benefit from the time savings and the higher level of engagement today's platforms can bring you. You can learn more about Better Impact and our software volunteer impact by asking around among your PAVRO peers or by going to www.betterimpact.ca. Thanks and have a great conference.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to LiVE, PAVRO's annual conference. Today is the last day of our conference, and our theme this year has been Breaking Forward from Pandemic to Possibilities. My name is Deb Watch, and I am on the PAVRO Conference Planning Committee. And I was on last year's, the first annual virtual conference planning committee. And I learned a lot from Helena and Sharon. I am very pleased to be welcoming you here today on behalf of the board and the planning committee team. And my lovely co-host will be explaining why I'm all bundled up in this beautiful warm scarf on a beautiful day. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. For those of you who have been with us for all 3 days, I think you will join with me in saying that it has been a really educational and rewarding experience. And now to my co-host who will explain this lovely scarf.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's going to be a pleasure co-hosting with you for this last day of our PAVRO conference. My name is Amanda Maragos. I'm also a member of PAVRO. I am on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I am also in the mentoring program, and this is my first year being on the conference committee, and I am so grateful to be part of such a great organization. So for those of you who have been able to attend all 3 days of conference, you'll remember hopefully that on the first day, co-host Helena and I wore hats. And we wore hats just to represent all the different hats you have to wear as volunteer managers. Second day, we wore sunglasses because of all the different lenses you have to look through as volunteer managers. And today, we are wearing scarves. And the reason we're wearing scarves is because scarves can reflect so many different things, or they do so many different things. They keep us warm. Sometimes we use them as an accessory. Sometimes we wear them for cultural or ethnic reason or ethnicity for those reasons, for ethnic reasons. But either way, when we're wearing a scarf, it somehow reflects something about how we feel or what we're doing and who we are in some way. So scarves are kind of cool for that. And so it can be an expression of all different kinds of things in one moment. And as volunteer managers, part of the work you do involves reflecting who you are so much, all those different parts of you. So your natural skills, personal traits, personality traits, energy, all the work that you put out as volunteer managers reflect so many different things.
You're actually continuing with bingo today.
And so
we're
many
excited to announce our first 7 bingo winners. So we have Marianne Beardsall.
We need to mute somebody.
Incorrectly, but just excited to share that you guys won. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ade. So that's why we're wearing scarves today. So you're going to notice that Deb and I are changing out our scarves, just like we changed out glasses and hats the last sessions, just so that we are able to remind all of you about this special piece about you, about how much of you give of yourself and how you feel and all the work that you do. And that's why we're wearing scarves today, Deb. We're so excited to be with all these accessories all these 3 days. It's so fun. It's fantastic.
My scarves are ready, Amanda.
That's right. Mine are too. So now we would very much like to introduce you to our PAVRO president, Alex.
Hi everyone. And I just, as I was like watching you explain the wearable metaphor of the scarf, I just wanted to let everyone know that in fact, The two MCs kind of cook this up themselves, so we never know what's like, what's going to be coming up each day, and it's been delightful. Thank you so much. I love the different, like I said, wearable metaphors, and it just reflects what we do and who we are. So my name's Alex, and Alex Vasic, and I'm the PAVRO. I'm very honored to serve as your president of PAVRO, and I work very closely with the board of directors to ensure that PAVRO is your provincial association for professionals who engage volunteers. It's really exciting and encouraging to see so many of our members join us for this event, and even non-members. And we are particularly pleased to have participants who aren't members who may consider joining us. So you're all welcome here, and hope that you can connect with us again in the near future. So before I start, I'd like to share our new land acknowledgement that we just recently developed. And I'm just going to move my little box here so I can see the whole slide. There we go. PAVRO recognizes that our work and the work of our members takes place on Indigenous territories across Ontario. We recognize the ways in which those of us who are settlers have benefited from colonization and reflect on the attempted genocide of Indigenous people in Canada, which spans centuries. We call for the reconciliation of current injustices, as well as those that have been carried out against Indigenous communities, which include but are not limited to broken treaty relationships. We commit to working towards creating a just, inclusive, and vibrant community for all. We encourage you to learn more about the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples where you live, work, and play using tools like nativeland.ca. We also invite you to incorporate a land acknowledgement into your personal and or professional lives, and a sample template can be found on our website. I think there's a page 2. Yes. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using, and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since before settlers arrived and continue to do so. We invite you to reflect upon this land acknowledgement, what it means to your personal story, and what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice mean to you. This land acknowledgement is a living document that will be updated as we learn and grow. We welcome your feedback so that we can strengthen this acknowledgement, as well as relationships with Indigenous people and communities. Thank you so much. So as you work through the next couple of hours with today's stimulating topic, I just want to take another minute and thank our conference committee, the facilitators, the FAB MCs, all of you who have volunteered their time to make this a worthwhile event for you. And again, we recognize our sponsors, Charity Village, Better Impact. On last week, we had the Barrie AVA support us, and we encourage you to visit their websites. And now back to our MCs.
All right. Before we start on our very interesting topic for the day, I'd like us to take a moment to jump out of our busy work thoughts by doing a short and easy activity. So far this conference, we've started each day by refocusing our minds. We've had fun with the Zoom reaction buttons and the Zoom poll function. Today, we are going to refocus our thoughts by having fun with the chat function. I'm going to pose a few questions, and I would like you to quickly write in the chat box the first answer that comes to your mind. Amanda, my lovely co-host who has changed her scarf. We're matching now, Amanda. I've got some yellow in mine. And Amanda will keep her eye on the comments and may share some interesting ones with us. So here we go. Chat function to everyone. Go quick. If you had $1 million tax-free, what would be your first purchase or expense? Go.
All right, I see a home coming in. I see cars, new house, patio, vacations, traveling, pay off parents' house, create a foundation, cabana boy, tandem bicycle. Yeah, love this. Renovation.
Another dog. Oh, I'm with you.
A dog, pay for kids' university, cottage.
A few cottages.
New car.
Very
Ooh,
good.
someone said-
Okay, here we
Somebody
go.
said name change, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, Judy Miller, you'll have to tell us later. All right. The next question. What is one place you've always wanted to visit and haven't yet? Go. E.g.
Hawaii, Ireland, Vimy Ridge, Scotland, China, California, Newfoundland, Kelowna, Vancouver, Ireland, India, Spain, Scotland again,
Scotland, Loch Ness Monster.
Bermuda, Spain, Italy, Kenya, Australia, Bora Bora, out west in Canada.
Very good.
Very cool.
I'd like to go with the Loch Ness Monster person. All right, next question. Look around you. What do you see that is purple? And I don't see Kathleen because I would have put Kathleen Douglas. Okay, go.
Oh, someone said my top walls, binder, volunteers vest, a book, file folder. Some people are at work, obviously.
Hair dryer.
More there. Swiffer, notebook, orchids, roses, drawings, scarf, sticky note, highlighter, no purple, water, lavender, wall hanging, Oneida flag, laptop bag, hand sanitizer dispenser.
Very good, everybody. You guys are good.
You guys
All
are
right.
fast. Helping me
last
brush up on my
question.
reading skills.
Last question. Oh, that was it. Oh, that was fun. Oh, wow, we did that so efficiently, not unexpected for engagers of volunteers. Oh,
True
I forgot
enough.
one question. Here we go. And I was all prepared for this one because my answer is Robin Haley Gillen. Who is the funniest person you know? Go.
Me. I'm joking. I like that myself. Okay, we see kids. My son, Lori V, love you, Deb. Amanda, Helena, Deb. Someone's BFF, coworker, grandkids. See you later.
Okay, now that was the last question. And not unexpected that we did so well and so fast. We are engagers of people and we have to make quick and fast decisions in our profession. So now my lovely co-host Amanda will introduce our guest speaker, Rami.
Okay, so I am so thrilled to introduce this next speaker to you, and mainly because he happens to be a very good friend and colleague of mine that I've worked with for years and years and years. He himself has over 3 decades of hospice palliative care and volunteer management experience in healthcare and social services. It's a privilege having a colleague who has worked within such a diverse group of professionals and volunteers join us today. I personally have learned a lot from him, and I know you are going to enjoy his session today and learn from him as well. He'll introduce himself a little bit more, but it's my super duper pleasure to say welcome, Rami, to PAVRO's conference, live conference.
Thank you, Amanda. Is there an echo there? Do you hear an echo with my microphone? I got a super duper microphone now.
Ooh, it's fancy.
All right, but we have no echo, right? We're good? And you left the most important part out of my bio, which is a great dancer. You know that.
This is true. This is true. This is true. He's a fantastic dancer.
Anyways, this is exciting. This is exciting because I've been advocating and promoting and speaking about trauma-informed principles and practices, especially within volunteer services, for a few years now, almost 5 or 6 or 7 years since I stepped on the stage at the conference at HPCO at Hospice Palliative Care Ontario. And here we are at PAVRO. When you invited me, I was absolutely over the moon, Amanda. So thank you very much for this, for the stage, for the platform, for the opportunity to share about trauma-informed principles and practices within volunteer services across so many other domains, not just restricted to hospice palliative care, but to a much larger aspect of volunteer services. So I do have a presentation, but I would love, and I very much appreciate that it's an opportunity to share this presentation, but I do want to show you a video that is very meaningful to me. So I'm going to actually start with that. Give me a moment. Don't you love Zoom? And I'm going to start with that video because I mean, it's a bit of an icebreaker, but you had you both had, you and Deb had the best icebreakers. Because it speaks to diversity, inclusivity, it speaks to creativity, it speaks to my story as a hospice volunteer for 19 years before I stepped into paid roles. And it speaks to an aspect that we're gonna look into a little bit stronger today, a little bit more deeper today, which is being trauma informed. And I really believe, are we really giving volunteers the right tools with which to provide the services they have? And you'll see by some of the stats I showed today, by some of the engagements and measures with which traumatization has actually affected our society. And COVID-19, for all it's done and all the trauma and loss and pain and suffering and death that it's caused, it really has brought to light the impact of traumatization to the entire social sector, and especially to how we need to equip our volunteers with this approach, with these skills and these practices. And we can't talk about a trauma-informed approach without having an land acknowledgement. I so appreciate Deb and Amanda for having the acknowledgement. So well, that's been said. And this moves us to this video. This video was created by an organization called Stories for Caregivers. I highly recommend you look on it. There's 20 different videos about caregivers, and volunteers are in many ways caregivers, informal caregivers. And my story is in here about when I was a hospice volunteer, about this particular situation with a family 20 years ago, how I supported this family as a volunteer, and how I felt equipped at the time in many ways to address the aspects of bedside companioning in the home from a trauma-informed diversity lens. Although I didn't quite know it at the time, it somehow seeped into the work that I was able to provide as a volunteer, especially given my life story, which I'll share a little bit more. But the beauty of this video is that it takes the story and adds the creative expression of musicians, some of them who are quite famous. I was starstruck to be beside Biff Naked, and Jarrell the Young and Junior T, like these amazing individuals. And then Asante is the person that interviewed. So I hope you enjoy the music video. And I really wanted to show it to you because it reflects on my story as a volunteer. I'm sorry I made it about me, but it really reflects on my journey through volunteerism and what it's taught me and what it brought me to the here and now.
Back to Cypher, the show that takes caregiving stories and turns them into songs. In this episode, we collaborate with Junior T, Jarrell the Young, and
me. Junior was recently shortlisted for this year's Polaris Music Prize, and he's Jesse Reyes' tour DJ.
And Jarrell is a multi-platinum producer who's worked with Fall Out Boy, David Guetta, and he's just dropped a solo project.
So let's check it out. Ready? Dying is hard to talk about. But as caregivers, we need to have these conversations. And our friend Rami thought we could learn from a past client that he referred to as Alka.
How does it go?
Bring it back to the top.
Alka is a pharmacist assistant. She had trained overseas, came here, and had to overcome a lot of racism.
Rami's assigned to try and help Alka, who's working full-time, running her household, and trying to help her dad. She's drowning.
To surrender his care to someone else doesn't fit her cultural values.
That's just not how they do things.
She couldn't do it.
Nah, bro.
So what about us?
My mom was also a caregiver.
My dad, he was in palliative care.
I've had a number of family members pass away.
Mental health challenges have come and gone throughout my entire career.
Each of us relate to this story in unique ways. But bottom line, we all relate to it.
So many ways to say the same message.
Watching my hero fall apart while my babies grow. Weight of the world on my shoulders trying to break me slow.
Maybe pitch down.
I'm with that.
She says, I'm feeling really sad, but at the same time angry.
It just feels so deeply unfair.
Death does not always come quickly.
She said, I feel he's died before he's died.
You're almost like paralyzed.
Am I going crazy?
You're so underprepared for that actual goodbye. It's exhausting.
And I'm losing the time, losing my prime. When you get used to this life, who wouldn't cry? I'm losing my mind.
And I say, no, Alka, you're not going crazy. You're a caregiver that's burnt out, and the anticipation of death can create feelings before he's died.
I never really thought that you could grieve before someone died.
And that's like a lot of energy to give.
I'm learning so much.
Aspects of mental health start to creep in, right? Depression, anxiety, low sex drive, sleeplessness.
Some things never change when emotions need expressing. Trust is to be gained. That's right. It's hard to be this strong when every day words can't express the love underneath the pain.
Leading up to his death, the potency of her emotion became stronger and stronger.
Is this the moment we've been dreading?
And I said, Elka, and Raj asked me a very challenging question.
This is the moment we've been waiting for.
I told her that he asked me, is this what it feels like to die?
The curtain falls and all the lights come on in the hall. Oh, we loved it and now it's over. Raise the glass and have a toast up. Walking, laughing round this beer. Loving, losing, now we're here. What a beautiful day to die. What a beautiful way to say goodbye.
Damn. And she broke down. And she was in full anticipatory grief. But there was a moment, she talked, a moment of stillness where it was just him and her. His breath slowed down. He died in her arms. And then she just held him.
No more pain, no more sorrow. No more moments to exchange. Feel these feelings throughout me. Tomorrow won't be the same. No more pain, no more sorrow. No more moments to explain. Though I feel you around me, I won't forget, no regrets. So goodbye till we meet again.
When I saw Elka, there wasn't much tears. She said, you know, because I had the chance to feel my feelings, Rami, at the end, the grief wasn't as complicated or as harbored.
Today, we share some deeply personal feelings about caregiving for someone who's dying.
Good grief, it's the good grief.
And we came out the other side stronger.
It actually changed the entire song.
Yeah, that's it.
Can you sing it again if you don't mind?
Yeah.
So goodbye till we meet again. So goodbye till we meet again.
You know, he presents it like this. This can help break down the barriers. A life's work, man. To be able to be a part of this, you know, I got touched.
So a minute, folks. I'm trying to get to my next slide.
In the meantime, Rami, while you're pulling that up,
Decipher.
while you're pulling that up, there's definitely people sharing
Welcome
in the
back
chat.
to Cypher, the show that takes.
I apologize, Samantha.
No, that's okay. That's okay. There's definitely people sharing in the chat, giving you thanks and an appreciation that the video was beautiful, especially someone in particular who has recently lost their mom. So just wanted to keep you posted on that in the chat.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Usually I monitor the chat, but here we are in Zoom and trying to navigate this. Here we go. All right, we're back in gear. So thank you for the comments in the chat. Why I wanted to show that to you, everyone, and thanks for moderating that, Amanda. I did wear my scarf today. It's got a little bit of a buzz to it, a little bit of a spike to it, you know. And why I wanted to show that to you, everyone, is that was 20 years ago. I've been in this work in hospice palliative care for 31 years, and 19 of it was a hospice volunteer. And you don't really realize, maybe sometimes, the impact we have in the services we provide, either in volunteer services as managers, supervisors, coordinators. I look back on that, and I'm presenting on a story, on an experience that I was very honored and privileged to be a part of 20 years ago, and it's having an impact today. So it's quite honoring. There's lots of good stuff at www.storiesforcaregivers.com, including other volunteer stories. I really encourage you to check it out, because it's a different way of looking and sharing our experiences as we support the general public and public services. Now, Southern Ontario, why I wanted to present this to you in terms of a trauma-informed approach, Southern Ontario is probably the most diverse demographic of people in the world. We have it almost all, right? And these demographics become volunteers, become volunteer managers, and are served by volunteers. And that demographic of diversity is inclusive of immigrants, refugees, indigenous peoples, different social economic backgrounds, different housing situations, different languages, ethnicities. In Southern Ontario alone, there's 192 dialects of languages. And I'm speaking Southern Ontario because I don't know the rest of Canada or the States or Europe. I'm talking Southern Ontario, which is a lot of where my work has been. And when we think of that measured diversity, especially as it approaches to human rights, we can't help but not include the aspect of traumatization. Often when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusivity, we speak to a lot of the aspects of the human rights descriptions of what diversity is. But trauma and traumatization is left out. And I think that's a really important part of diversity, because when we look at personal culture, we look at who and what we are as individuals, not in a culturally competent or culturally sensitive lens, but in a culturally humble lens through the perception of a personal culture. One of the most influential aspects of who and what we are in a measure of diversity is trauma and traumatization. One of the things that almost counteracts equitable services and access to services is trauma. One of the things that is exclusive and causes exclusion and negates inclusivity is trauma. And you just have to look at the social sector to see how many people are excluded and not receiving equitable service and not recognizes it in their diversity due to traumatization, and the coping mechanisms that are involved in dealing with aspects of traumatization. I get all fired up about this stuff. I'm so excited I'm talking to PAVRO today. Anyways, I'm going to provide you with a background on trauma and its effects. I'm going to contextualize trauma within volunteerism, and I'm going to review some of the frameworks for approaching volunteer roles through a trauma-informed approach, including a little bit about harm reduction, a little bit about culture, safety, and humility, and some aspects of anti-racism and anti-oppressive practices, all which are under the umbrella of a trauma-informed approach. And in complete transparency, I did this presentation over 2 days for VON Oxford, and I'm scaling it down from a 3 to 4 hour presentation to 45 minutes. So this is just scratching the scratch of the surface to give you a call to action, to motivate you and fire you up to learn more, apply more, and build more of a trauma-informed approach within volunteerism. My family came from war-torn countries, so I'm no stranger to traumatization. My childhood was very difficult because my parents both experienced something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or something I think they call it post-traumatic stress syndrome now. I was born and raised in Canada, but I grew up with a lot of childhood developmental trauma, right? So I'm no stranger to it, but it didn't come to light until I was in my 40s. And that's how subversive traumatization can be. Many times we don't even know we are expressing it and behaving through it as it's impacted our lives. And that's me just a few years ago, and about 25 years ago. I know I haven't changed much. I still have my COVID haircut. I grew my hair out for COVID, and I grew a beard as well. But I feel that nobody really understood or really was progressive in a trauma-informed approach with anti-oppressive, anti-racist practices as it was this fine lady. She really started the ball going many, many, many years ago. She established 50 social service organizations that were steeped in anti-racism, anti-oppressive, and especially trauma-informed care. She got trauma. And it wasn't called trauma-informed back then. We've created a different way of engaging it now. She, of course, established Casey House in honor of the traumatizing death of her son being hit by a drunk driver while he's on his motorcycle. Her name is June Caldwood. We honor volunteers in her name. But in that particular moment, I'll never forget that moment, because it really established my career and my volunteerism and who and what I am as a person. Because in that moment, she made me feel like I was the most important and the most paid attention to, from her perspective, person in the room. Now that's not a self-indulgent, egotistic appeal. That's a trauma-informed people, because she saw me as a whole person. She saw the whole person. She saw me. And I'm suspecting she saw the trauma that lurked within me, and she gave me full attention. That is a trauma-informed approach. When we start to truly look at the entire person, when we talk about person-centered approach, especially in volunteerism, are we including those aspects of awareness of the expressions of traumatization? I don't think so, not yet. Certainly not yet. And that's why I'm here to bring that to you. So I've served in hospice palliative care for over 30 years, many, many, many different hospice palliative care programs. across Canada, in the States. I'm working with some people in death doula program in New York City, and then helped open a hospice and a day program in Trinidad, in Cora province in Trinidad. So I've seen a lot of death, a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of traumatization. And 19 of those years was as a community volunteer and a residence volunteer, but specifically a community volunteer in hospice palliative care. And what sustained me all these years, and what's really my soapbox of an advocacy now, is for us to include the aspects of traumatization, of death, of grief, of bereavement, of change, of evolution, of COVID, of diversity, of racism, of oppression, in who and what we're training to serve those individuals, and even self-reflectively on themselves, which is volunteers. A lot of my work right now is on the streets of Toronto. If anybody can guess what that street corner is, I'd be very impressed. This individual is someone who was living with a life-limiting illness and experiencing homelessness. And that's really where trauma-informed practices took root for me. Because you can't serve a population that is living in some measure of homelessness, because it is a continuum, right? It's from vulnerable housing to abject living rough. You can't support individuals who may have experienced a great deal of trauma that result in homelessness and coping mechanisms such as chemical coping or substance use without having a trauma-informed approach. And I know I'm saying what a trauma-informed, and I haven't given you a definition because I'm kind of building up to it. I'm starting to give you the examples and measures with which it's used before I actually give you a definition. And I think by nature, the term trauma-informed speaks to what it is. It's to be informed of how traumatization expresses itself. And nowhere did I see that more clearly than working with people living with a life-limiting illness while not having housing, such as those who are experiencing homelessness.
Rami, we got some responses. Was it either Front and King or King and Bay?
Oh, nice. It was actually King and Bay. Well done. Northwest corner. If I could give you a scarf,
Yep.
that would be awesome.
Madeline Locke got it right on.
Should be a prize for that for Madeline. Nicely done. But isn't it an interesting backdrop to be in the center, in the heart of the financial district of Toronto, and be living on the streets of Toronto? I mean, that's the disconnect sometimes we have in our society. Anyways, I'm very privileged in my work. Is that I work at Kensington Health as a case manager. I also I'm the bereavement support at Kensington Hospice, and I work as a caregiver support in the community as well as in the long-term care facility. So I have this cool job that gets to see and be at bedside, gets to support bereavement, gets to support caregivers in the community, while also supporting residents and caregivers in the long-term care facility, which is a really amazing continuum. But it's an opportunity for me to see how traumatization manifests. And it's an opportunity for me to advocate and support volunteers as they provide services, their imperative services, through a trauma-informed lens. The other place I work for is Lighthouse for Grieving Children as their multicultural outreach coordinator. Again, that's another model of trauma-informed, where we see the impact of grief and states of bereavement on the traumatization of a child's mind, and how that can change and impact their entire lives moving forward, and how important it is to address aspects of traumatization. Our programs are almost exclusively volunteer run, besides some of the staff that establish the programs and sit in groups, but we were truly peer support volunteer based. And I think COVID has really emphasized how important and how vital volunteers are to every aspect of our roles. Like our hospice was really struggling without volunteers because they couldn't be at bedside due to aspects of COVID. I also do a lot of consulting in hospice palliative care and train and teach a lot, especially on diversity and trauma-informed. And speaking of diversity and trauma-informed, has not the pandemic really emphasized the impact of traumatization? The pandemic itself could be in and of itself traumatizing because it constantly creates this perception of threat, or it can exacerbate experiences of traumatization already there. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, is that the pandemic, in its almost consistent, constant, invisible threat, has triggered and almost exasperated traumatization, experiences of traumatization that already exist within us. And I really ask this all the time. Why are we not talking about trauma in volunteerism? Why are we not talking about it in every aspect of volunteer management, services, training, and coordination? If the people we are supporting in any capacity of volunteerism. And it doesn't matter, from driving to gardening to kitchen help to Meals on Wheels to bedside companioning to support on the phone. If the people we are supporting in the diversity that is represented in Southern Ontario is reflective of some of these capacities. We have a pandemic. Well, we can put the pandemic aside just for a second. We look at intergenerational aspects of Canada, of Southern Ontario especially, in first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation Canadians. And there is documentation of even how our DNA changes through generations as a result of ancestral trauma. And Indigenous peoples have been telling us that for years, for decades, for centuries, maybe not centuries. There's racism now, the impact of racism. My parents experienced a great deal of racism. So did I. You don't have a unibrow and a name like Rami Shami without experiencing some kind of bullying and racism in the demographic that I grew up in. But the impact of racism and its traumatizing aspect, the impact of the traumatization of gender specificity and sexism, or the lasting traumatization of colonialism, or child maltreatment, which I experienced a great deal growing up. The spike in domestic violence now as attributed to COVID-19, and the traumatization of that, the impact of war, of refugees and immigrants who are fleeing war to come to Canada and end up being served by our volunteers. Schools and communities, the bullying, the harassment, the sexual harassment, the gun violence that we're witnessing. Those are aspects of traumatization. The medical trauma, there's some great literature by Dr. Peter Levine and Dr. Gabor Mate and Bruce Perry that talks about 1 night or 2 nights of routine hospital admission can cause traumatization that is somaticized in the body. Dr. Nahid Dasani talks about living 1 night in the street and how traumatizing that could be. Sexual assault, accidents that are still within our energies, in our bodies, in our feelings. I talked about immigration and refugees, and traumatic grief, which is differentiated from grief and bereavement. And then there's a program, I don't know if it's Laurier or Waterloo, that actually launched a climate change program that speaks to the trauma, the traumatization of our hearts and minds, especially in younger populations, as a result of a future impacted by climate change. So we even have to look at climate change in terms of its traumatizing aspects. If this is a measure of diversity within our society across the world, really, but we're looking at Ontario and Canada, then how are we putting volunteers to serve this population? And if this population is reflective, oh, that's my boss calling. That's Nadine calling. Hey, Nadine, I'm giving a presentation at PAVRO. It's awesome. I'll call you back. Okay, bye. I have to do that. And if this is the population of volunteers coming, if this is a population of individuals coming to volunteerism and they're experiencing this kind of traumatization, how are we not equipping them with that self-awareness and that knowledge and that self-reflection? It's imperative. It's absolutely imperative. I think it's as imperative of anything in volunteer management and training and education. Dr. Peter Levine says, trauma is the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated causes of human suffering. No doubt. And I think that is one of the strongest measures of diversity that is missing in how we support people. Now, let me ask you, I'm going to throw it up in the chat. I want to give you so much, and I don't want to rush through everything, but I want to throw so much at you, and you have a video and you have the PowerPoint, so you can go nuts. Let's look at trauma. Please throw up in the chat. How do you define trauma? And in fact, throw trauma into Google or into Netflix or into Prime and see what comes up. And you know what comes up? Acute aspects of traumatization: murder, rape, war, violence, school shootings, all the acute traumatizations. And not to diminish those acute traumatizations, but they're actually not the majority of experiences of traumatization. The majority of experiences of traumatization are things we don't even identify as traumatic, like 1 night or 2 nights of routine hospital visits, like the death of a loved one or a family member or caregiver or someone that we care about, a longstanding illness that we don't expect to be traumatizing. It is not, and in Dr. Bruce Perry's work, it's not necessarily the person who's experienced homophobia that's traumatized, nor is it the person that he or she or they are telling it to. It's the third person hearing the story that becomes traumatized. So you can hear that there's aspects of traumatization that are much broader scope than what we are attributed to the actual definition. I know there's some great answers. Let me see what you folks are putting out there.
Yeah, we've got some great answers, Rami. Do you want?
Life-altering vulnerability, event experience. I appreciate that, Jill, but it's not necessarily deeply distressing or disturbing. And it's not necessarily an event. It could be events. And it could be so subliminal or unconscious that we don't even recognize it's overwhelming us until one day we have a tipping point and it all overcomes and expresses itself. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I wish I had the time to read it all and reflect it all. But let's give you a definition from CAMH. All right. CAMH is one of the foremost mental health organizations, but I don't think they got the definition right, humbly speaking. Trauma is a lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Now, I'd love to change that definition. I don't think it's just emotional. It's physical, psychological, psychospiritual, existential, environmental. There's so many aspects to traumatization that it's not just emotional. Dr. Peter Levine talks about how it actually internalizes into the body and becomes somaticized and becomes part of our bodies. And it's not just one distressing event. It can be a cascade, a collective of events. And it doesn't necessarily have to be distressing in the moment. The distress might not be recognized and appreciated and acknowledged till much later, when the symptomatology or the experience starts to take place. And it's not necessarily lasting, because there are interventions with which trauma can be healed, can be dissipated, can be moved through the body. I'm a living example of that. And it works to some of the definitions. Trauma is not necessarily something we have. I've heard many people say, I have trauma. Trauma is the event. Traumatization is what happens to us. So you can say, I have traumatization, but we don't have trauma. Trauma is the event itself that has elicited a response, a reaction, an experience that has a feeling to it or a physicality to it. And here's some examples of traumatic events. One that could possibly leave somebody feeling overwhelmed, but not necessarily consciously. A lot of times the overwhelmed hits us on our subconscious, unconscious, and in our bodies. It compartmentalizes it, it puts it somewhere. And until certain circumstances poke at it or trigger it, it's not expressed. It's an event or events that can be perceived as threatening. And that's an important point, because every one of us, how many people we got today? 85 people. Every one of us will perceive what is threatening differently. It's very unique and very individual. And that's why it's infused with personal culture. And that is why it's a measure of diversity, unlike almost anything else. It's extremely unique. What one person perceives as threatening, somebody else may not. It can leave a person feeling out of control, helpless, and unable to assimilate or integrate the event or events. But rarely is that what somebody says to us. Usually it's the behaviors and expressions. Like this one gentleman I was caring for, he was experiencing homelessness, living in one of our residences, dying of cancer. And he'd say to me, make my bed there, to that point, right at the wall. No, move it over here. No, move it back. No, move. And we do that for half an hour. That was his effort to gain control and trust with me to make sure the bed lined up. It can be an event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope with the traumatization, but that also depends on the coping mechanisms, because very quickly we can develop coping mechanisms like substance use, suicidality, hypersexuality, to address and dissipate the tension of a traumatization. So it's very important to see what are the expressions of trauma, not necessarily assume that they are going to be experienced and perceived the same by everybody. And very much traumatization can be thought of as a memory that's stuck, a memory that we keep reacting to, a perception of the world that's threatening that we keep responding to. And there's literally changes to the brain that happens in traumatization. CAT scans and MRIs have showed that certain parts of the brain stop lighting up, and those are usually the thinking parts, the cortex, while the other parts, the emotional parts, the instinctive parts, light up like fireworks. That tells you that we can actually get crystallized in a perception of threat for the world. This is a great book. I highly recommend it. It changed my life in many ways because it told my story. That's literally my story, the boy who was raised as a dog, because I was raised as a dog, in all vulnerability and all honesty, okay? And some of the amazing work in there that Dr. Bruce Perry talks to is the fact that 60 to 70% of children, let alone adults, who have been diagnosed as ADD or ADHD are misdiagnosed. They do not have the condition of hyperactivity. they're suffering from traumatization. Because when we've experienced trauma, our fight or flight, freeze or fawn response, the one that gets us going to run away or to fight, is on stuck high alert. It stays on all the time. So for example, me, I flunked out of university 3 times because I was constantly moving, constantly hyperactivity. I couldn't figure it out. I realized inside of me was this traumatization. Interestingly enough, that only calmed down when I was sitting in front of people who were dying, right? That's an interesting piece. It's really saved my life in many ways. And this hyperactivity was actually me needing to fight or flee instead of it actually being diagnosed as a clinical aspect of hyperactivity. Now imagine that with our adults. Imagine that with the people we serve. Imagine that with volunteers, how the impact of traumatization can affect even the way we serve, the way we act, the way we behave, the way we are present with others. And that's why June Caldwood was so impressive to me, because she was so present. And I wanted that. I said, I want that. And I don't think I've ever achieved it, but I feel like I've come close in many ways. And did you know that 5 minutes of exposure to a traumatizing event or events can change our brain for the rest of our lives? 5 minutes. Our brains are that nimble, that malleable, that can change in response to a traumatizing event. This is an outdated stat. 76% of Canadians have experienced at least one traumatizing event in their lives. I would say now, with COVID and what have you, it's closer to 90 or 95%, right? All the aspects of racism and anti-racism, oppression, the pandemic, and experiences of everyday traumatization in life, that number has probably gone through the roof. But if we play with that number, and we have 85 people on the line today, that means 77 of you, if I did my math correctly, have experienced at least one traumatizing event in your lives. And if you're volunteer managers, coordinators, supervisors, directors, or volunteers yourselves, and you've experienced one aspect of traumatization in your life, where is that? And how is that going to interface with who we support, who we serve, and how we serve them? So it's an imperative aspect of who and what we are. I ask all the times, why, and this is a second piece to the first part, I should have said part 2 here. Why is there in our scopes of service not aspects of a trauma-informed approach? What about the settings we are asked to serve in? Especially, pre and post-pandemic, the settings volunteers are asked to serve in. For example, in hospice-palliative care, we ask volunteers to be listening, kind, compassionate, safe space creators, right? Or advocates. And what do you think happens when you create a safe space and you're compassionate and empathic with somebody who's experienced traumatization? What do you think happens to the volunteer who is asked to sit in a present, in a sense of presence and safety and comfort and space? What do you think happens to within them? And then we ask them to listen. That tells you why I struggled for many years as a volunteer to sit and be present, and why somehow I was able to garner an approach which kept me in the moment, even considering the traumatization I'd experienced in my lives. Now we look at volunteers and volunteer managers, 76% of them have experienced at least one traumatizing event in their lives. I ask also in the training, why do we not have trauma-informed training in all our volunteer training? We have other things. Why are we not putting traumatization? If 76 to 80% of you have experienced one traumatizing event in your lives, and the people we serve have experienced that capacity of traumatization, there has to be an awareness of it. There doesn't necessarily have to be counseling and therapy to trauma. There has to be an awareness of how it expresses itself. Otherwise, we're putting volunteers at risk. Otherwise, we're putting the people we serve at risk. Right? Anyways, there's a number of other things, including social media, news, and world events that can be just as traumatizing as a third party listening than the events themselves. Because what's happening with social media and world news is that in the moment when we're experiencing a traumatic event, we have coping strategies and dissipations and ways to fight and flee and move. When we're just listening to it and experiencing it without necessarily having an opportunity or the awareness to do something about it, it internalizes and we don't even know it. Let me tell you a little bit about the prevalence of trauma. And this is, I left this because this is from 18 years ago, 17 years ago, something like that. Yeah, about 17 years ago. And just look at the languaging we used to use back then. Victims of trauma are found across all systems of care. We don't say victims of trauma, but that's how it used to be perceived. 90% of individuals with some mental health condition or mental illness have experienced traumatization. 92% of people who are experiencing homelessness have some aspect of traumatization that either result in homelessness or they experienced on the streets. 85% of people experiencing or utilizing substances have some aspect of traumatization. There's so little research or any focus on trauma and traumatization within volunteerism. Maybe in some pockets, you know, in terms of acute care or EMS or you know, auxiliary police, but is it really self-reciprocated into our experiences of traumatization? Here's some of the trauma outcomes to give you some idea of how trauma works through us. There can be, at the time of a traumatic event, we usually have an adaptive response that makes us work with the event. But then that gets stuck, and then it's projected on everything else in our life, or so much else in our life, and becomes maladaptive. And then that's when things don't work the way we perceive them. We perceive threat everywhere. We develop relational mistrust. Trauma has a way of making us not trust others and not trust even the structure of life. And that's not going to come out in a volunteer interview. That's not going to come out in recruitment. You know, it can be very well masked. But in services is when we see the lack of trust in either. I think that's why a lot of us, like volunteers, violate boundaries, break boundaries, right? There's a mistrust even in management, because it's seen as authority, and authority might have caused them traumatization at some time in their lives. So why are they going to listen to it? Such as myself. You know, I experienced at the hands of authority a great deal of traumatization. And then there's this survival mechanism that gets stuck, that we start to see the world through this survival mechanism. And it's constantly on. Either we fight it, we flee from it, we fawn, meaning we fake it, right? Or we freeze. We become dissociated and locked in a particular state. And that can be a chronic state of engagement. But we'd never see it if we don't see the expressions and outcomes of it. And it really depends on the perception of the person as they see the world. Perception is the key if somebody sees the world as threatening, or sees people as threatening, or services as threatening. How we experience events in our lives determines if they're threatening or not. So what would be traumatizing for one person might not be for another. And that's the measure of individualization and personal culture within diversity. Let's look at some of the psychological dimensions affected by trauma. There could be affect dysregulation, meaning what I feel inside and what I show you in my facial expressions and body language are disconnected. They may not actually match, which is very hard to read, right? There can be dissociation, which we see either in clients or people we serve, or even in volunteers that we've checked out. But in fact, sometimes we dissociate from our experiences so that we don't feel them anymore. That's why it's very hard sometimes to even recognize when somebody's experienced traumatization, except when it gets triggered or through behaviors and expressions. There can be actually a change in self-perception. So the way we see ourselves changes. And I've heard this even from people I serve, is that I don't deserve the care. I don't deserve being, you know, what you're giving me. I don't deserve your love and compassion. I don't deserve your empathy. Go away. Fuck off. Right? And we label that and put it in a box and call it aggression and demanding, or isolation, or self-barricading, when in fact, it could be just simply, not simply, but it could be just a change in self-perception. There can be disturbance in relationships between us as volunteers or managers and the people we serve, or with the clients and the people we serve and us. And my absolute favorite in traumatization is somatization. I say that slowly because I have a hard time pronouncing it. I stutter sometimes when I get excited. And somatization is when traumatization and the experiences of traumatization become part of our soma. They'll come into our bodies and they're expressed through our bodies. And that's when it's almost shunted from our minds, our rational minds, because our rational mind has been turned off due to traumatization, and becomes part of our bodies. Now you imagine that when it comes to applications of a touch or movement or pain, that's sometimes when traumatization can surface. And then there could be alterations in systems of meaning. And what that means is that what we thought and what we've established as a system of meaning. For example, volunteers provide services and support and compassion and help and companionship and all that can be seen as threatening because the meaning behind them is no longer trusted. Everything's seen, or many things are seen, as a threat. And I've heard it from people that I've served, is that, why would you come and give me your time? Nobody gave a shit for so many years. You're going to come and give me your time now? And that is due to traumatization. Some of the effects of trauma included, as I mentioned, changes to the brain. And I think that's important when it comes to training such as nonviolent crisis intervention and aggression and harassment, what have you, because the thinking part of the brain has been turned off as a result of traumatization. There can be increased physical and mental stress, which is also an interesting piece, because if you have traumatization and you have a pandemic and you have physical, mental, and emotional stress as a result of the traumatization, and then the threat of a pandemic, it actually gives fuel to the fire of traumatization. And if you take volunteers and you put them in a stressful role when they're experiencing or have this latent belly of traumatization, it can actually exasperate and express it. And we'd never see that in a volunteer interview. And if it's not properly trained and brought to aware or recruited with, then we'd never see it in our traditional trainings that we have and orientations. There can be decreased trust, there can be compromised immune systems, which is really interesting because there's a traumatization of the pandemic, which also decreases and compromises the immune system, which feeds back to a vulnerability to the virus and a lack of traction for the vaccine, and it just starts to cycle. One of the most important pieces is the attachment difficulties. And it's an attachment in a engagement way, not like a child and a parent. The attachment is that they may not be able to connect with us. Somebody who's experienced traumatization may not be able to connect, not necessarily because it's conflictual, because they're afraid of loss. The trauma has caused a sense of threat that somebody would be afraid of losing that which they attach to, meaning a volunteer or the care a volunteer can provide. We end up stuck in a state of hyper or hypoarousal. Instead of being in this self-regulated space, we get jacked up and high adrenaline all the time, or we become dissociated and lacking affect. And both those states are very challenging to navigate, both for us as individuals experiencing them, but in the people we serve. So that is actually sometimes a barrier. Sometimes people in hypoarousal are left and saying, oh, they're fine, they're good, they checked out. Or in hyperarousal, they're thought of as demanding and difficult. And if we take those terms and apply them to volunteers, what are some of the, respectfully, what are some of the labels or generalizations or stigmas that we put on volunteers that may be experiencing, though, not recognizing that they have experienced some aspect of traumatization? And then we look at rigid and chaotic behavior, which are times expressions of a lack of control or choice. Some of the tension-reducing behaviors can be substance use, and many of us engage in substance use. Substance use doesn't just mean crack and cocaine and heroin. It's coffee, it's chocolate. I just had a bunch of chocolate to give me some energy. Maybe that's why I'm hyper. It's overdosing on chamomile tea. There's other aspects of substance use, but there's such stigma on substance use, only to recognize that it's a way to reduce tension as a result of traumatization. There can be experiences of suicidality. That was my childhood and teenage years. Suicide was my escape. I could always get out of the trauma in my head and my heart if I thought about taking my own life. There can be hypersexuality. There can be what's stigmatized as binge eating or overeating to satiate, to release endorphins, to reduce the tension. And one of my favorites was spending sprees. I used to work at a hospice called Dorothy Lay Hospice. I was director of community and volunteer services there. And for 5 years, I'd go to the fancy mall next door, Sherwood Gardens, and I spent all my money there buying clothes that I'd hang up in my closet and never look at. And what I was doing was recognizing that I was reducing the tension that I was experiencing as a result of my work and my experiences of traumatization by buying something and leaving it immaculate. It wasn't until I realized I was broke and didn't have any money in my bank that I came to the realization that I was engaging in a tension-reducing behavior. And then there's aspects of what we define as self-harm. But I was corrected when I was teaching this last year in Hospice Niagara, that an individual stood up and she said, well, you know what? Cutting wasn't self-harm for me. It was self-preservation. It kept me alive. It dissipated the tension out of my body. So I frame it as self-harm, self-preservation in both contexts. But the bottom line in that is that it's a tension-reducing behavior. Now, to look at how trauma affects our brains and how it kind of very, very simplistically can affect us. We have traditionally, but prehistorically, this instinctive brain, which is called the thalamus. We have a thinking brain called the cortex. And then we have an emotional brain called the amygdala. And how usually we work, and it's in the way we process the world, is that our instinctive brain receives the information, our thinking brain figures it out, and sends it to the emotional brain and says, act, all right? This is how kind of it works. But this is a very slow process. If you come across a snake, you come across, a fast-moving car, you come across an assailant, you come across something, that 0.24 milliseconds that it takes to react through a thinking brain would probably get you killed. You can't sit there and Google and say, hey, is this a poisonous snake? Is this no. We have to act faster. So we've developed biologically through evolution, or whatever you define, a process that is half that speed, if not less. And that cuts out the thinking brain and goes straight to the emotional brain. So we see something, we perceive it as threat, bang, an emotion reacts, and we either jump, we fight, we flee. What happens in trauma and traumatization is that becomes stuck. That neural pathway that turns off the thinking brain or the cortex becomes stuck to just reactions and emotions. So we perceive, we react, we perceive, we react. And that can happen to any one of us, and it happens to a lot of us. It can have flashes of stuckness, or it can have a chronicity in stuckness, which ends up in something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. You might have heard of it. And this is an important piece because in many ways, we can't rationalize through talk or helping somebody to think their way through an experience if they have experienced traumatization that's turned off that aspect of their brain. That's just an awareness we have to be mindful of, because then it relates on communication strategies, nonviolent crisis intervention strategies, and way to engage people who have experienced traumatization in the line of service. And then let's look at, oh yeah, thanks, Amanda. All right, cool. So triggers, many triggers. Just think to yourselves in your settings that you send volunteers, what are some of the triggers in there that can trigger traumatization, that can trigger pre-existing traumatization? Because all of our settings have it in some way. I've seen it in hospice palliative care where you think you wouldn't have any triggers, and we're putting up barriers, and we're stopping this, and we're moving this, and we're moving to abstinence models without a harm reduction approach. Those are all aspects that can trigger somebody. So how may trauma present in volunteerism? We look at it in our behaviors of the people we serve, or even ourselves. We look at it from pain and symptoms that can be exasperated or expressed as traumatization. We look at our coping mechanisms. We look at even substance use and chemical coping. I see expressions of traumatization across the board in caregiving, whether it's informal or formal caregivers. I see it very often in caregiving, especially working at Lighthouse for Grieving for Children, and seeing how it can dissipate and change or take root and change a person's life. We see it in even how people speak about suffering and how it manifests into post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Now, how can we use a trauma-informed approach in volunteerism? So this is kind of the meat of it I'm going to share with you now. I love this definition. Trauma-informed care can be defined as practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. And the operative word here is culture. The culture of volunteerism has to be steeped in safety, empowerment, and healing. And I think we think it is, but if we're not using a trauma-informed approach that speaks to traumatization, then how can we say that? How can we truly feel that? And you'll see what I mean when I speak to actual principles of trauma-informed care. I love this definition. The trauma-informed approach can be utilized by anybody. Anybody. You don't have to be a psychologist, therapist, psychotherapist, counselor, physician, nurse, anybody. Because all it does is assume that every client, resident, patient, anybody we're serving, including ourselves, may have experienced some form of trauma. And we don't necessarily have to question it or question experiences or even have the skill, which I don't, to go into the traumatization. That's not the point, nor is it necessary, nor is it warranted. We just assume the possible history of trauma, and we assume that some of the expressions and behaviors are a result of traumatization. And then we apply principles of trauma-informed care, which is cultural humility. And the foundation of cultural humility is personal culture, which is also control, meaning how are we designing our programs and our supports and our services so that it affords a measure of control for the person we're caring for, or we're recognizing how they don't feel in control. Or even with volunteers themselves, sometimes when we have boundary issues and boundary challenges, is there an aspect of traumatization that is fueling a sense of need to be in control and then respectively violate boundaries? And the piece about empowerment. We don't empower people, we create environments with which they can gain empowerment, right? how are we creating environments with our volunteers and with the people we serve that are opportunities for people to feel empowered? And we talk about compassion. Compassion is not empathy. There's a difference between compassion and empathy. Compassion is compassion, similar feeling, and like commonality of feeling. So when we talk about traumatization, it is the recognition and awareness of the expressions of traumatization by whoever's providing the service from the person who is experiencing the service. We walk alongside that. Empathy ends up sometimes getting caught up in the projection of traumatization onto the person, or a vicarious resonance of that traumatization with the person we're supporting. And in our settings that we're providing, support as volunteers, is it okay for somebody not to trust us? And how does that make us feel? I can't tell you how often that's been an issue with, nurses and PSWs and physicians and volunteers. Well, they don't trust us. Well, if they don't trust us, maybe they shouldn't even come here and have the care or have the support. But that's the unconditionality, the unconditional positive regard that Carl Rogers talks about, of recognizing the impact of traumatization in creating mistrust, and us building a setting with which the mistrust is unconditionally supported. And who defines safety? When we're talking about traumatization, it has to be the people we're serving that define what is safe to them. And it's okay for them not to feel safe and to tell us that they don't feel safe, while we still unconditionally provide services. And what about volunteers? Maybe on some perspective, some of their behaviors, their actions, their expressions come from a feeling of not feeling safe that have nothing to do with the policies and procedures of our organization. It comes from trauma and choice. Some volunteers I've trained and worked with, choice was a big challenge. Because of the experiences of traumatization in their lives, choice was so important for them. So boundaries, policies, and procedures were challenged all the time because it wasn't seen as an aspect of choice, which led back to an experience of traumatization. This is palliative care. I'm going to skip palliative care because it's too specific. I think we have a much broader audience today. Let's look at some of the languaging. From a deficit perspective, instead of seeing what's wrong, let's look at it as what's happened to this person. Instead of seeing the symptoms, look at it as adaptations. Instead of disorder, let's see it as response. Instead of attention seeking, let's see it as a way to connect the best way we know how. Instead of being labeled as borderline, let's look at somebody doing the best they can with their early experiences. Instead of controlling, let's look at individuals trying to assert their power. Instead of being manipulative, let's look at an individual who has difficulty asking directly for what they want. And instead of malingering, what about it's somebody trying to seek help the way they feel safe? And let's use trauma-informed language. Instead of addiction, abuse, alcoholic, and even smoker, right? Or even, let's look at some terminology that puts the person first, that it's value neutral. And let's look at the way we even inflect our voices, not just with people we serve in volunteerism, but even with our volunteers, so that the value is not inferred. For example, you use substances as opposed to, okay, so you use substances. See the difference? Same words, right? Because stigmatizing language perpetuates negative perceptions. And let's look at preferred names and pronouns. That is huge right now, especially in the work I do with people experiencing homelessness. I can't tell you how often whatever's on the form, whatever's on the file, whatever I've been told the person's name is not who the person's name is. They actually have a different name and a different identity. So normalizing and validating someone who has experienced trauma can be one of the most powerful engagements that us as staff and volunteers can make. I call it trauma glasses on and trauma glasses off. Trauma glasses on, people are getting needs met in the ways that have worked in the past. They may feel threatened, unsafe, out of control, fearful of being re-traumatized. They may feel out of their comfort zone, unfamiliar with the environment. They may feel depressed, alone, overwhelmed, in the fawn phase of fight or flight. We all hear about fight or flight, but we don't hear about fawn and freeze, and especially fawn, where we kind of fake death, not in a hospice way, but we fake death so that the threat doesn't come near us. And that's expressed as humans very differently. There's some great work on that. There may be a sense of mindfulness, afraid to make progress because of repeated losses in their lives. And then there's an aspect of vicarious traumatization. It's such a catchphrase. And it's an important aspect of recognizing the impact of trauma, meaning being with others who've experienced trauma and traumatization, projecting it and hearing it from them and their stories, that it traumatizes us. But I think a more important piece of that is that our own aspects of traumatization, considering 70 to 80% of us have experienced one traumatizing event in their lives, is that it already triggers and exasperates traumatization within us. The vicariousness is actually reciprocal. So trauma-informed approaches, especially within volunteers and volunteer management, has to be reciprocal. It's for the clients and people we serve, and it's for a recognition and awareness of our own experiences of traumatization and the resultant behaviors and expressions of those experiences. I work a lot with people experiencing structural vulnerability, so I'm gonna speak to this just briefly, because that is where a lot of the work in trauma-informed care is really taking traction. Maybe because it's permissioned, maybe because it seems to be more evident, whereas in other social, economic, and demographics, traumatization is more phobic and hidden and unrealized and unaccepted and all these other things, okay? But there's some great work, and it's interesting that the populations that have experienced great marginalization are the ones that are really teaching us and leading us through a trauma-informed approach, and those who are experiencing structural vulnerability. An aspect also of trauma-informed care is anti-racism and cultural safety. It is the experiences of racism, the traumatization of racism, that is also fueling the trauma-informed approach. It's like a triangulated piece, that racism often exists as implicit bias and unconscious bias, and can be in so many aspects of our decision-making when we support people. And then there's an aspect of oppression. And I won't get too much into this because we could talk a whole university course on oppression. But oppression is an important aspect of traumatization because of the experiences of refugees, immigrants, people experiencing structural vulnerability, indigenous peoples who are coming to volunteer and who are they themselves receiving volunteer support. If we don't understand and look at the root causes of oppression, such as racism, transphobia, xenophobia, colonialism, capitalism, then how can we actually be truly person-centered when we're providing care for people? Harm reduction, again, the piece about harm reduction is just that it's a human rights principle. It involves non-judgmental. It's to reduce the harm and risk in whatever activity an individual is engaging. I think we have to teach harm reduction principles, because it's not just about drugs and drug use. If you drove somewhere today and you wore a seatbelt, that's a harm reduction approach. If you wear a condom, that's harm reduction. If you wear a mask, that's harm reduction. And we have to utilize that within the perception and training of volunteers so that they recognize the principles and human rights principles of reducing risk. And this is one of my favorite things. This is my kintsugi bowl. And I'll round it out with the next couple of slides of the kintsugi bowl. The kintsugi bowl is an ancient Japanese healing practice. It means that something that has been broken can in some measure be brought back together and accentuated with the gold lines, not to beautify it, not to beautify what's happened to us, but to shed awareness on it, to bring awareness to what has transpired within our lives. So this is my bowl, and it's been broken a few times. And it's been brought back together, and there's some pieces missing and some cracks and some pieces not even fitting properly. But it's my bowl. And I look at it, I painted lines in gold because I look at it and say, that's my life. Those are the traumatizations. Those are the losses. Those are the aspects of my life that have evolved into who and what I am. But you know what is the kicker in this? What's the most important piece? Is that's the bowl that I volunteer with. That is the bowl that I serve everybody with. That's the bowl that I walk into people's homes, stories, residences, you name it. That's what I bring. And if I'm not aware of that, and if I'm not even helped by training and orientation to gain an awareness of it, then I walk in many times blind. And that bowl interfaces with everybody else's bowls who are in some measure of healing and brokenness, without the judgment of brokenness. But there's some measure of change, right? Some pieces are missing, some have come back, some are still cracked, some have holes. But that's volunteers serving in a volunteer capacity. That is volunteer managers, a depiction of volunteer managers, coordinators, supervisors, directors that are also supporting volunteers. And that's the people we serve. So how can we not talk about trauma-informed approaches? It's imperative. The bowl speaks it. Some final points. 1 minute left, Amanda, 1 minute left. Some final points. Trauma affects how we see the world and how we interact with others and how we cope. You don't need to know someone's trauma history to provide trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is truly person-centered care. It focuses on trust, empowerment, and safety as defined by the situation, by the people we serve. Experiences of trauma can cause suffering. Our actions as volunteers and volunteer managers and supervisors and coordinators can either help alleviate or exacerbate suffering. I believe in the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no re-traumatization to ourselves and to the people we serve and care for. And having an understanding of structural vulnerability, harm reduction, cultural safety and humility, anti-racism and anti-racist practices will truly enhance our ability to provide trauma-informed care. And I feel those pieces are imperative to be in any volunteer orientation in any volunteer setting. And finally, I love this depiction. This is, for me, the utopia of a trauma-informed approach within a volunteerism. I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary. It's called Serving Life. It's about a prison in Angola, Pennsylvania, that has 5,000 inmates, that has trained volunteers, hospice volunteers, trained volunteers who support other inmates, except those trained volunteers are inmates themselves. So they support one another. And I love what the great Reverend Desmond Tutu says. He says, a person is a person through another person. My humanity is caught up, bound up inextricably with yours. Thank you very much, folks. I'm sorry, I want to show you so much, and I kept cutting down the slides and then building them back up because I want to share so much with you, and I hope I gave you just enough to pique your interest.
Yes, oh my goodness, Rami, you certainly did, and thank you so much. There is so I've been watching the chat, and there was one question in particular that a few people brought up, and it was more asking the question about like a practical coping technique that you have. Like, what do you do so that when you enter a space, you can slow down and be present, given all of this?
Give me another 3 hours.
I know. Just for you personally, though.
I presented on this yesterday. So I have a number of practices that have sustained me in the years that have, but the most important one, the most effective one is what I call the pause. And it stirs a lot within me. It hasn't been healed. It's still there, but I do a lot of work in the field. So I know whatever I'm doing is working. And I call it the pause. And I've practiced it for many years, but I really learned it when I went to a hospice in California that unfortunately has been sold now. It was called Zen Hospice Project. And there I watched volunteers, PSWs, they don't call them PSWs down there, they don't, but volunteers, PSWs, physicians, nurses, family, caregivers, friends would stop and take a breath 5 seconds before they entered the residence room, right? It was a hospice residence where people came to die. And then I looked down at the floor and there was these 2 footprints in the ground. And so what I'm recognizing is that it was a Buddhist Zen practice where they'd stop at the doorway, gather themselves, check in with their bodies, ground, and then step in. So what they were doing was almost centering. They didn't tell me what they were doing. I just watched them. They would do it like they'd stop, step, come back out, stop, and step into somebody else's. And I applied that to everywhere in my work and my personal life, the pause. Because in the pause, what it actually does to our central nervous system, to our fight or flight response, it gives it a buffer. When you check in on it and bring awareness to it, it can actually just calm it down enough that it comes maybe down from hypoarousal or up from hypoarousal. It's not in every case, especially when the trauma within me, the traumatization within me is really exasperated. And I have those moments, okay? Find me at 401 on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock and, you know?
Yeah.
And so that aspect just takes a moment of pause and gets me through my day. So I can work in the long-term care. I can work in the community. I can work on the streets of Toronto or in the shelters, and I can work in our hospice residence. It's a pause. And I do it 4 or 5 times a day just to be a consistent, and the important piece is consistent and sustainable practice. It's not like you just do it once when your fight or flight is on fire. No, you do it preemptively and proactively. That is number one thing. It's called the pause.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for that, Rami. I love that, that practical practice is so important and to pause. It's actually why I even started doing Tai Chi now on Sundays, just because it slows me down. So I totally appreciate that as one of the strategies. There are some people in the chat asking about resources, and just a reminder to everybody that you will be getting a post-conference package after this. So Rami, we may connect with you to send us some things. Rami has agreed to share the slides with us too, so we will have that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rami, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I have lots of. Oh, sorry, I hear an echo, so maybe somebody has their mute off.
Oh, I don't know.
That's okay.
Oh, just me.
I have lots of resources, books, but it's so interesting because there's no trauma-informed education and training for volunteerism and volunteers. I've taken it from everywhere else and brought it. So I've done my own research for the past 5 or 6 years. I will share it with you all. Books, articles, training, PowerPoints, videos. Yeah. There's some great stuff we put up on YouTube that we've done in the past. Don't hesitate, because my almost life mission is that I'm a volunteer at heart, really at heart for the rest of my life. And I want to hopefully provide you with the skills and tools and resources with which to stay safe and provide safe support.
Well, thank you so much. And on behalf of all of us here right now, I just want to sincerely thank Rami for this session. And, just based on everything we've just heard, I love that the opportunity we have now is to take this information, this new awareness that some of us have now, and then now we can practice beyond traditional in-person care that we offer volunteers, and community-based initiatives, and just everything we do as volunteer managers. We can take this now to go beyond traditional ways that we've been preparing our volunteers to do this, the different types of incredible work they do. So thank you so much, Rami. We are going to take a 10-minute break now. We'll return at 12:30 sharp, at which, in that time, we're going to do what we've done like we did in the other sessions, where we'll have some different breakout rooms where we have 2 questions to discuss. Rami, I hope that you'll be able to continue joining us for that, and maybe jump into some of these rooms, hear what people are saying. But we'll start with a 10-minute break and return here at 12:30.
Thanks, Amanda.
All right. Thanks, everybody.